fiscal picture, right? And priorities for 2026. What is our government going to prioritize, right? And if you look at issues to do with the wage bill that you spoke about in your question, you will realize that indeed, even Treasury itself, National Treasury has acknowledged that 56% or so of total revenue, right, it goes to salary. 56 or 60% goes to salaries, and it's that an acknowledgement that the government itself does acknowledge and says this is what is prevailing in Zimbabwe. Why? Because of deindustrialization, you end up having a large wage bill because the government ends up employing lots of people, and it's not bad for the government to employ lots of people, but there are consequences if the economy is not growing and the private sector is not thriving, private businesses are not thriving, and thereby creating employment, because the government alone cannot employ everyone in the strictest sense. There are countries which have achieved full employment, for instance, but when you look at those countries that have achieved full employment, it's not the state only which has been employing people, right? But it is also the private sector in partnership with the government. So that's the first area that's of concern, the issues to do with the wage bill. But let it not be something that we are misquoted to say that we are saying we don't want the government to employ. We do want the government to employ, but also want the productive base of the economy to grow so that we manufacture, add value to our minerals, add value to our maize, add value to different raw materials that we have, so that we create more jobs downstream in downstream industries, in the mining sector, for instance, further processing the gold that we mine in this country. If 60% of our gold output is coming from artisanal small scale miners, and we're experiencing a gold boom currently in the world, it has been around for months now. Gold prices have been high, right? Imagine if we were actually taking the rents, that is the revenue from gold that we're getting from gold, and actually channeling that to downstream industries, and we can then manufacture jewelry, for instance, right? And we can get research and development, investment in research and development by the state and the private sector, so that we have the technical know expertise and technology to process our gold. That would mean we create jobs. Just as an example of how we can deal with the issues to do with unemployment, right? But also, it must remember that the government of Zimbabwe recently, I think, it approved a new national youth empowerment or employment strategy, which will cover 2026, I think, to 2030. This again seeks to expand youth access to jobs and entrepreneurship. Again, the government is realizing that without jobs, without entrepreneurship, the government alone cannot continue to cannot employ people and sufficiently raise the necessary revenue to develop this economy, to make it a modern economy, to make it an economy that is labor or jobs intensive. So there's this acknowledgement, there's this policy that was recently launched by the government. But again, in Zimbabwe, we all know that the issue is not policy per se, but the implementation of some of the sound policies. I was reading a Herald article recent tonight, and where they were quoting the president of Zimbabwe, who was speaking at the World Social Development Forum, some meeting which is being held in Doha in Qatar or somewhere. And he was saying that Zimbabwe from 1995 to date has managed to halve poverty. And those are contested, arguments, because when you look at the prevailing scenarios in our country, youth unemployment, for instance, economic informality, which the government itself, through Zimsters, the Minister of Finance, says 70%, 76% of the economy is informal. Then we are hearing that this country has halved poverty since between 1995 and to date, but you still see the challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Again, that shows you that even the way in manner in which poverty is calculated, what are the metrics that the government is using to? So we need to question this um, orthodox, right, from the neoliberal guys who are manning government today. However, how then do we? Because the question is, how then do we reach a scenario where we address this crisis, where there's the BSP is actually acknowledging, the budget midterm statement is actually acknowledging that no, the wage bill is too high. How then can the 2026 budget address this? Number one, but also what are then we'll talk about the opportunities for that young people want, the things that we want to see as youth, as I mean, the stats indicate that we constitute a significant share of the population, if not 60% or so, and stuff like that. So, for instance, this job crisis that we are talking about, number one, that the revenue base is shrunk or is limited in Zimbabwe. That's why there are debates now where if you follow the Minister of Finance and what they've been talking about at a seminar that they're holding with parliamentarians, and if you follow conversations that happened at the ZANU PF conference in Mutare, you realize that one of its resolutions as a party was that the IMTT so-called 2% tax should be removed because it's regressive. That's the party. Then the minister deployed by the same party was telling parliamentarians today, the Honorable Minister of Finance, that no, I can't scrape off the IMTT because the existing revenue base at my disposal where I can get money is limited. So you have on one hand a high wage bill constituted a high government wage bill, but on the other hand the contradiction, a small revenue base according to the Minister of Finance, and is arguing that this regressive tax, the IMTT, which has actually saved off I mean it actually destroyed disposable income and actually contributed to poverty and income inequality in the country. He cannot scrape it off. Again, those are bad signals already with regards to the 2026 national budget. So the revenue base is regressive. What is needed, right, is that because the current scenario, moderated fellow listeners, is that a majority of the revenue in Zimbabwe currently comes from individual consumptive or consumption taxes, right? So the state or the Zimbabwean government's income itself as a government is tied to household purchasing power rather than production and capital income. All right. So what do I mean? When he says I'm not going to remove the IMTT, it is households and individuals who pay the IMTT when we transact. All right. So he's saying so that's how regressive the revenue base is. So that needs to change. Because if the existing revenue base continues, these are the problems that it has created. Two problems in our view. It squeezes the working poor and compresses domestic demand because people now shy away from spending. So there's no aggregate demand in the economy because the little income that people are earning, right? If you then go and buy a TM supermarket or Pick and Pay or okay, you swipe with your card, then they take the 2%, the bank taxes charges and stuff like that. You are forced to tighten your belt, right? As a household, as an individual, you the choice, what you call personal austerity. So that again limits. So it doesn't help the government anyway to a great extent or the economy productively, because if people don't spend money in the economy, it means there is low aggregate demand, and inevitably the state cannot collect much more revenue in the form of VAT and stuff like that. So that's the second point is that it leaves the state weak in mobilizing resources from the sectors that actually produce tradable goods like your manufacturing, agro processing, mining, value addition. So the budget strategy paper itself, when you read it, it signals the need to broaden and deepen what we call domestic resource mobilization or domestic revenue mobilization. What do you mean by domestic resource mobilization or domestic revenue mobilization? We're saying because this country is highly indebted, I know the figures are contested because the Ministry of Finance through the Public Debt Office or what was reported in the midterm reviews that Zimbabwe owes 21 billion US dollars in that's the total public and publicly guaranteed debt. But the IMF in its Article 4 report of October 2025 says Zimbabwe's public debt is underreported. The IMF argues that we owe 23.3 billion as public debt. So already there's no transparency and accountability into how much the public debt is in this country. So that's a problem. And the 2026 national budget should address that. So because the constitution is read together, the Public Finance Management Act and the Public Debt Management Act clearly stipulates and calls upon the Minister of Finance, responsible finance, to update the nation on the state of the public debt. I refer you to a case.
I'm giving you a minute to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll try and see how I can speak to everything in a minute because the issues are so many. But what I'm trying to say is we need transparency from the Minister of Finance in the 2026 national of how much we actually owe as a country, because you can what will help us to domestically mobilize resources is how also transparently we manage our public finances, how we plug illicit financial flows. For instance, the prosecutor general of this country said that we lose $120 million to illicit gold and mineral outflows per month in the gold sector alone. That's 1.2 billion US dollars annually. We are saying if they can plug those revenue leakages in the gold sector alone, regulate the artisanal small scale miners, regulate, and also make sure even mining corporations, big or small, are also responsible for the illicit dealings, right? So if the Mines and Minerals Amendment Bill passes through Parliament, and it tightens the screws on how on dealing with the leakages, then there's enough money that we can domestically mobilize. Number two, they have to implement the wealth tax that was introduced by the Finance Bill, Finance Act of 2024. Because recently the midterm statement said we have not yet come up with a mechanism to implement the wealth tax. So how then do you then send the budget strategy paper? We want to do domestic resource mobilization, but you don't want to implement the wealth tax because it's one of the progressive ways to raise capital, to raise revenue for the government instead of squeezing the poor already 76% of this economy, which is in the informal sector. But since you said I have now maybe 30 seconds or so, what are the fundamentals that we want to see in terms of the budget for 2024? We want to see a clear wage bill rebalancing plan, not just slogans that we want to deal with the wage bill. No, there must be a plan. For instance, young people should demand for a time-bound cap and trajectory for example, aim to bring the wage bill down from 56% to below 50% within 12 to 18 months, right? Then to a sustainable 40 to 45% medium term with a published implementation matrix by the Ministry of Finance, right? Number two, the government in the 2026 budget must ring fence and reallocate savings from wage rationalization into productive capital expenditure because this country needs to be productive and produce, right? For instance, prioritize energy, reliable on grid and off grid renewables, because without enough energy, you can industrialize transport, logistics, roads, rails, etc. Right? Digital infrastructure, water, because once these fundamentals are addressed, you then lower the cost of production for business and even for government itself. And business can then create jobs, right? Entrepreneurs can then thrive, right? Three, shift the tax mix from regressive consumption taxes to growth friendly taxes. All right, I think I mentioned world tax implementation matrix. Remove all these regressive presumptive taxes that he recently introduced. The Minister of Finance taxing, hairdressers, combis, driving schools, but that will affect job creation. Those businesses will close, right? And more people will be plunged into unemployment. Instead, as I said earlier on, takes the super rich, takes the mining corporations, remove those tax breaks that they give to mining corporations and stuff like that. I will end here in the interest of time. Then, if I have
Thank
another
you.
opportunity.